Let me show you what Belgrade really looked like on this morning. Not from stories or legends, but through the eyes of the Hungarian and Serbian soldiers standing on what was left of its walls. Belgrade sat where two rivers met, the Danube and the Sava, on a tall limestone cliff that rose high above the water. Before the attack, it was a powerful fortress. The castle stood at the highest point, surrounded by thick stone walls built to stop medieval armies. Below was the lower town, protected by wooden fences strengthened with dirt, running down to where fishing boats used to dock peacefully. That was 18 days ago. Now it looked like the end of the world. The lower town was gone. Every building burned to the ground. Wooden fences shattered into ash and splinters. Smoke still rose from ruins that had been set on fire a week earlier. Where Christian defenders once stood, Ottoman trenches now scarred the earth. Artillery positions were carved into the ground. Turkish flags snapped in the wind over conquered territory. The castle walls, thick stone that had protected the city for generations, were broken in over a dozen places. Huge holes gaped like wounds where cannonballs weighing hundreds of pounds had hammered the same spots for days without stopping. Towers that once stood 3 stories high were reduced to stumps of shattered stone. Where walls still stood, they were covered with cracks, one more attack away from collapse. The moat that circled the fortress, meant to be the final barrier, was half filled with rubble. Collapsed sections of wall had tumbled into it, creating rough paths the Ottomans could march across. Mixed with the stones were bodies, hundreds of them. Turkish soldiers in padded armor, Christian defenders in whatever they'd worn when they died, swelling in the July heat. The smell carried on every breeze. Inside the castle, the streets were filled with debris, shattered roof tiles, cannonball fragments, pieces of buildings that no longer existed. Defenders moved through the wreckage like ghosts, faces blackened by powder smoke, eyes hollow from weeks without real sleep. The constant thunder of Ottoman cannons had left many half-deaf. Men shouted to talk to each other, standing 3 feet apart, and still couldn't hear each other over the ringing that never stopped. Blood stained the cobblestones in every street. The wounded filled every building that still had a roof. The dead were piled outside the chapel because there was no time to bury them properly and no space to dig graves. And now, through the smoke and dust hanging in the air, the defenders saw something that froze the blood in their veins. Ottoman flags rising on their own walls. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of Sultan Mehmed II, the same troops who'd broken Constantinople 3 years earlier, had broken through the walls. They were inside, planting their flags on stone that Christian hands had defended for 18 days of hell. Europe's last fortress on the Danube was falling. But 2 old men standing in that shattered castle, one a dying warlord, the other a fanatical friar, were about to do something no one thought possible. Before we see how they defied an empire, if this story grips you, hit that like button and drop a comment below. It helps us share real history with people who care about more than just dates and names. Now, let's go back to where this began. The fall of Constantinople. To understand why 2 70-year-old men were willing to die on Belgrade's walls, you need to go back 3 years to the day the world changed. May 29, 1453. Constantinople fell. For 1,000 years, Constantinople had been unconquerable. The triple walls were engineering marvels. An outer wall 40 feet high, backed by a second wall 30 feet high, backed by an inner wall that rose another 40 feet. Between each wall ran a moat. Towers every 50 yards provided overlapping fields of fire. Byzantine emperors had poured fortunes into those defenses, and for over 1,000 years they'd worked. Every army that tried to take Constantinople broke against those walls. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians. Crusaders had tried during the Fourth Crusade and only succeeded through treachery, not force. The walls themselves had never been broken by direct assault. Then Mehmed II brought something new to warfare: artillery. Not small guns, industrial-scale siege weapons. The largest cannon, called Basilica, was a monster that required 60 oxen and 200 men to move. It was 27 feet long with a barrel so wide a man could climb inside. When it fired, the explosion could be heard 10 miles away. The stone balls it launched weighed over 1,000 pounds and traveled fast enough to crush masonry on impact. But Basilica wasn't alone. Mehmed brought dozens of bombards, smaller but still devastating. Hungarian engineers who defected to Ottoman service operated them. German mercenaries, Italian renegades, the best artillery minds in the world, all working for the Sultan. For 53 days, those guns hammered Constantinople's walls day and night in rotating shifts, never stopping. The Byzantines tried everything, hanging leather hides to absorb impacts, building inner walls behind the breaches, launching night raids to destroy the guns. Nothing worked. The walls that had stood for 11 centuries were reduced to rubble in 8 weeks. When the final assault came on May 29, Mehmed's Janissaries poured through multiple breaches at the same time. Emperor Constantine XI, last of the Roman emperors, heir to a title that stretched back to Augustus Caesar, died fighting in the streets. No crown, no throne, just a sword in his hand and enemies on every side. His bodyguards found his body later, headless, trampled by thousands of feet. They identified him by his purple boots embroidered with golden eagles, the last remnant of Rome. The city burned for 3 days. When it was over, Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom, the new Rome, the city that had stood for 1,000 years, belonged to Islam. Think about what that meant for Europe. Your entire life you've been told Constantinople is protected by God, that its walls are invincible, that as long as Constantinople stands, Christendom is safe. It's not just a city. It's a symbol, a promise, the proof that Christian civilization can endure. Then in less than 2 months, it's gone. If Constantinople can fall, what's safe? Your city, your village, your family? The psychological shockwave was devastating. Refugees flooded west with horror stories. Popes called for crusades that never came. Kings made grand promises they never kept. Merchants changed trade routes because the land route to the east now ran through Ottoman territory. And Mehmed, just 21 years old when he took the Queen of Cities, proved something terrifying. With enough cannons and will, any fortress could fall. Which meant nowhere was safe. The march to Belgrade. Mehmed turned his attention northwest, toward Belgrade. The city wasn't as grand as Constantinople. No legendary history, no 1,000-year-old walls. But strategically, it was more important than any city in Eastern Europe. Look at a map. Belgrade sits exactly where the Danube and Sava rivers meet, the meeting point of 2 major waterways. The Danube is the highway of Central Europe, connecting the Black Sea to the German states. Whoever controls the Danube controls trade, military movement, everything. Belgrade was the lock on that door. Beyond Belgrade lay Hungary. Beyond Hungary, Vienna. Beyond Vienna, the German states, Poland, Italy, the soft heart of Christendom. If Mehmed took Belgrade, the road to Western Europe lay wide open. In summer 1456, 3 years after Constantinople, Mehmed assembled an army that dwarfed anything Europe had seen in a generation. Estimates vary wildly because medieval writers exaggerated, but even careful sources agree, this was massive. Somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men. Sipahi cavalry in chain mail and steel helmets. Provincial infantry from across the empire. Akinci raiders, light cavalry who specialized in terror. And the Janissaries, 10,000 to 12,000 of the best-trained infantry in the world. And he brought the guns, the same artillery that broke Constantinople. The march north began in early June. Village after village emptied as refugees fled ahead of the Ottoman advance. They carried stories of what was coming, an army that stretched to the horizon, cannons that could level mountains, soldiers who didn't fear death. By late June, all of Europe knew Mehmed was coming for Belgrade. And nobody was sending help. Hungary's crisis. Hungary, the kingdom responsible for defending Belgrade, was collapsing from within. King Ladislaus I was 15 years old, a boy controlled by rival noble families who spent more energy fighting each other than preparing for the Ottoman threat. The Hunyadi faction, the Ujlaki faction, the Garay family, all maneuvering for power while the greatest threat Hungary had ever faced marched toward their borders. The royal treasury was nearly empty, drained by decades of internal conflicts. The Hungarian army was scattered across the kingdom, defending 100 minor frontier fortresses, none with enough strength to matter. Morale was shattered. For 30 years, the southern borderlands had been a nightmare. Ottoman raiding parties crossed the frontier regularly, burning villages, taking slaves, destroying crops, then vanishing before Hungarian forces could respond. Entire regions were emptied of people. Those who survived lived in constant terror. Now the largest Ottoman army in history was marching north, and Hungary's nobles were arguing about who should control the teenage king. The regents refused to let Ladislaus ride to Belgrade's defense. Too dangerous. Couldn't risk the king. Western Europe, France, England, the German states, Italy, sent prayers and nothing else. The Pope called for a crusade. Nobody came. Put yourself there. Your greatest fortress just fell to an enemy who's now targeting you. Your king is a teenager controlled by squabbling politicians. Your allies have abandoned you. No help is coming. Do you run? Surrender? Try to negotiate and hope for mercy? Or do you stand with whatever you have and fight? Hungary had one man who chose to fight. John Hunyadi, 70 years old. Dying. The White Knight. His origins were controversial. Some claimed he was the illegitimate son of Emperor Sigismund, conceived during a campaign in Wallachia. Others said he was the son of a minor Wallachian nobleman who rose through merit and brutality. The records were deliberately vague. Hunyadi's questionable birth was a political weapon his enemies used against him his entire life. What wasn't questionable was his record. For 40 years, John Hunyadi had been the scourge of the Ottoman Empire. He'd won a legendary victory defending Belgrade in 1440, driving off an Ottoman siege. He'd crushed an Ottoman army at Niš. He'd led deep raids into Ottoman territory, Wallachia, Bulgaria, Serbia, burning supply depots, destroying garrisons, making the Turks fear Christian counterattacks for the first time in decades. He'd become the most feared Christian commander in Eastern Europe, the one man the Ottomans respected and hated in equal measure. But now, in summer 1456, Hunyadi was dying. Some wasting illness, fever, chills, weakness that left him gaunt and gray. He could barely eat. Everyone who saw him knew he didn't have long. When word reached him that Mehmed was marching on Belgrade with the army that broke Constantinople, John Hunyadi made his choice. He would go to Belgrade, hold the fortress, or die there. But he knew the brutal truth. He couldn't do it alone. He needed an army, and Hungary's paralyzed nobility wasn't giving him one. Then, as if in answer to a prayer he probably didn't believe in, God sent him a madman, a 4-foot-tall Franciscan friar who claimed to have visions and promised peasants they could defeat empires through faith alone. His name was Giovanni da Capistrano, and he was about to raise an army that defied all military logic. The fanatic. Giovanni da Capistrano had never held a sword. He was 70 years old, same as Hunyadi. But where Hunyadi was a practical warrior who understood warfare's brutal math, Capistrano was a fanatic who believed math didn't matter when God was on your side. He was a Franciscan friar, 4 feet tall, shriveled from decades of fasting and preaching. Before becoming a monk, he'd been a lawyer and governor in Naples until a scandal landed him in prison. There, he claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to him in a vision and told him to abandon worldly power for spiritual warfare. He'd spent the last 30 years doing exactly that, traveling Europe, whipping crowds into religious frenzy, preaching against heretics, Jews, and now the Ottoman threat with apocalyptic fury. In spring 1456, Pope Calixtus III gave him a mission: raise a crusade to save Belgrade. Capistrano saw it as prophecy, the final battle, Armageddon on the Danube. He started in southern Germany, moving village to village with a banner showing Christ crucified. His method was calculated theater. He'd arrive in a town square at noon when people gathered for market. No advance warning. Just this skeletal old man appearing with his banner, climbing onto a platform, and beginning to preach. Not calm sermons. Explosions. Witnesses who heard him described the same pattern. He'd start quiet, talking about Christ's suffering. Then his voice would rise, describing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. The churches defiled, the priests murdered, Christian children taken as slaves. His voice would crack. He'd weep openly, real tears streaming down his face. Then he'd hold up his crucifix and make the promise: any man who took up arms against the Turks and died fighting would bypass purgatory entirely. Straight to heaven. No waiting, no judgment. Immediate salvation. For medieval peasants who believed they'd spend centuries suffering in purgatory for their sins, this was revolutionary. Die fighting Turks, wake up in paradise. And Capistrano didn't just preach miracles, he performed them. Or at least people believed he did. In Nuremberg, a woman brought her daughter who couldn't walk. Capistrano placed his hands on the girl's legs and prayed. The crowd swore she stood up and walked. In Frankfurt, a man blind in one eye claimed he could see after Capistrano touched him. Real miracles. Mass hysteria. Staged performances? It didn't matter. The people believed, and belief was what Capistrano needed. The peasant army. Understand who answered his call, not the powerful, the powerless. Medieval society was a pyramid. At the top, nobility who owned the land. Below them, knights who fought for the nobility. Below them, free farmers who worked land they didn't own. And at the bottom, serfs, basically slaves bound to the land they worked, forbidden to leave without permission. Capistrano's crusade pulled from the bottom. Peasants who gave 60% of their harvest to lords and survived on the rest. Men who worked dawn to dusk every day with no hope their children's lives would be any better. Criminals in local jails, thieves, brawlers, men who'd poached deer from noble forests to feed their families, offered pardons if they took the cross. Serbian refugees who'd fled when the Ottomans conquered their homeland, now living as displaced outsiders in Hungarian towns, burning for revenge. Old men past their prime, too weak for farm labor, told by their families they were useless mouths to feed, desperate for one last chance to matter. For most of them, life was suffering interrupted by more suffering. Hard labor, hunger, disease, brutality from nobles who viewed them as livestock. No escape, no hope. Then Capistrano showed up and told them they could be heroes, warriors of God. That their poverty and suffering meant nothing because heaven awaited. That the noblemen who oppressed them would burn in hell, while they, the wretched of the earth, would sit at God's right hand if they died fighting Turks. It was the most radical message they'd ever heard. And they believed it. By the thousands they came. They marched with whatever tools they owned: scythes for cutting wheat, pitchforks for moving hay, wood-cutting axes, butcher knives. Some had actual weapons, old swords their grandfathers had used, rusted spears, hunting bows. Most wore the clothes they'd been working in when they heard Capistrano preach: wool tunics, leather vests, cloth wraps for shoes. Almost none had real armor. A few had leather jerkins. One man reportedly showed up wearing a cooking pot on his head as a helmet. But they had faith, absolute, unshakable conviction that God would protect them and guide their hands. Capistrano's crusade swelled as it moved east through Hungary. Entire villages emptied, men leaving fields unharvested to join the march. Minor nobles joined with small groups, bringing some military experience and actual weapons. Priests joined carrying relics: saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, holy banners. The columns stretched for miles. Dust clouds marked its passage. Hymns echoed across the countryside. By the time Capistrano reached the Danube in late June, estimates put his army between 20,000 to 40,000 people. Many were camp followers, wives who refused to be left behind, children, servants. But even careful counts put his fighting force at 25,000 men. An army of faith, led by a 4-foot-tall friar who'd never commanded troops in his life, marching to face the conqueror of Constantinople. When John Hunyadi saw them, his heart must have sunk. The uneasy alliance. He'd spent 40 years as a professional soldier. He understood what war actually was: not glory and miracles, but logistics, discipline, and knowing when to hold and when to retreat. He knew what it took to beat the Ottomans: trained soldiers who could hold formation under fire, cavalry that could execute coordinated charges, archers who could hit targets at 200 yards. What he got was a mob of religious fanatics armed with farm tools. The two men met in early July as Hunyadi prepared Belgrade's defenses. No detailed account of the meeting survived, but we know from later letters that they argued. Hunyadi wanted the Crusaders kept away from the walls, use them for labor, digging trenches, hauling supplies, building earthworks, anything but actual combat. Put untrained peasants against Ottoman Janissaries and it would be a slaughter. Capistrano refused. His people weren't laborers. They were warriors of God. When the Turks attacked, they would stand on the walls. God would guide their hands. The two men were opposites in every measurable way. Hunyadi, tall, aristocratic bearing despite his questionable birth, a man who'd commanded armies for decades and bore the scars to prove it. He spoke quietly, planned carefully, trusted experience over inspiration. Capistrano, tiny, skeletal from self-imposed fasting, eating one meal a day of bread and water, sleeping on bare ground even when offered beds. He spoke in absolutes, certain about divine intervention in matters he'd never experienced. He trusted God over tactics. But they shared one critical thing: neither would abandon Belgrade. Hunyadi because he'd spent his life defending Hungary and wouldn't stop now, even dying. Capistrano because he believed this was the prophesied battle, and fleeing would damn his soul. So they reached an uneasy agreement. Capistrano's crusaders would enter the city, but Hunyadi would command the defense. When, if, the time came for the crusaders to fight, Hunyadi would decide where and how. Capistrano agreed. For now. The defenders. Hunyadi arrived at the fortress on July 2 with his own forces, 5,000 to 7,000 trained soldiers. Hungarian cavalry, noble sons and professional horsemen in chain mail. Serbian mercenaries who'd fought Turks for years and survived. His personal household guard, 50 men who'd followed him for decades, veterans of a dozen campaigns. The garrison already in Belgrade, commanded by Hunyadi's brother-in-law Mihai Shalagi, numbered about 2,000. Shalagi had spent the past month preparing, reinforcing the lower town's wooden palisades, stockpiling food and gunpowder, drilling the militia, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. Then Capistrano arrived with his crusaders, and the city's population exploded. Tens of thousands poured through the gates, fighters, followers, families. The fortress couldn't hold them all. People camped in courtyards, in the lower town, anywhere there was space. Most couldn't fight worth a damn. But they had hands. They could carry stones for wall repairs, haul water from the rivers, tend the wounded, cook for the soldiers. In a siege, that labor was essential. And they prayed constantly. The entire city echoed with hymns and chants. Every church held services around the clock. Capistrano led prayers on street corners, in the castle courtyard, anywhere people gathered. To the professional soldiers, the constant religious fervor was maddening. But to the common defenders, men who knew they were vastly outnumbered, it provided something to hold on to besides fear. The Ottomans arrive. July 4, 1456. The Ottomans arrived. From the castle walls, defenders watched the horizon darken. Not with storm clouds, with men. The Ottoman army spread across the plains south of Belgrade like a slow-moving flood. The first units appeared at dawn, Akinci scouts on light horses, ranging ahead to check defenses. Then came the vanguard, provincial infantry in ordered columns, marching with drums beating. By midday, the main body arrived. Tent after tent rose across the plain. Command pavilions made of silk. Barracks tents for infantry. Horse lines for the cavalry. Supply dumps, field hospitals, an entire mobile city springing up within hours. The defenders counted banners, trying to estimate numbers. Every Ottoman province had distinct colors and symbols. Rumelia, the European territories. Anatolia, the Asian heartland. Karaman, Dulkadir, Egypt, newly conquered. Each banner represented thousands of men. Then came the guns. The artillery train took all afternoon to position. Teams of oxen hauled the massive bombards, guns so large they moved on custom-built wagons. Smaller falconets and serpentines came up on regular carts. Ottoman engineers surveyed the fortress, calculating firing angles, measuring distances. Powder and shot were unloaded from supply wagons and stacked in protected magazines behind earth walls. The largest bombard, the defenders couldn't know its name, but it was similar to the gun that broke Constantinople, required 60 oxen and took 3 hours to position. When it was finally in place, pointing at the lower town's palisades, the gunners built an earthen platform behind it to absorb the recoil. On the hill overlooking the fortress, Mehmed's personal pavilion rose. Silk walls dyed scarlet, gold crescent on the banners. From there, the Sultan could observe the entire siege. By evening, the deployment was complete. 60 to 80,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded Belgrade. Inside the walls, maybe 30,000 total, and most of them peasants with farm tools. Hunyadi stood on the castle walls with Shalagi, watching the Ottoman preparations in silence. Decades of experience told him exactly what was coming. Shalagi finally spoke. "Can we hold?" Hunyadi didn't answer with words. He just pointed at the Ottoman artillery positions, then at Belgrade's old-fashioned walls. The message was clear: those guns would reduce the fortifications to rubble. Whether they could hold depended on what happened after the walls fell. Beside them, Capistrano knelt on the stone battlements, crucifix raised toward the Ottoman host, praying in Latin. 48 hours later, the world would end in fire and thunder. The bombardment begins. July 5, 1456. Day 2. The first cannon fired at dawn. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physical. A compression of air that hit your chest like a fist, forced breath from your lungs. Men on the walls flinched automatically. Birds exploded from trees a mile away in panicked clouds. Horses in the city screamed and pulled at their tethers. The stone ball, roughly 2 feet across, weighing about 300 pounds, arced through the morning sky with a sound like ripping cloth. It slammed into the lower town's wooden palisade and destroyed 20 feet of wall in an explosion of splinters. The impact crater was 6 feet deep. Then the second gun fired. Then the third. Within an hour, every Ottoman cannon was roaring in a coordinated bombardment that would continue for the next 17 days. The pattern was deliberate, calculated to break both stone and mines. Ottoman gunners worked in 3 shifts, rotating every 8 hours, so the bombardment never stopped. When a gun overheated, and the massive bombards did regularly, metal expanding from repeated firing until cracks appeared, it was hauled back and another dragged forward to replace it. The Ottomans had brought spare guns for exactly this reason. Day and night, boom, wait, crash, boom, wait, crash. The rhythm became the heartbeat of the siege, drilling into your skull until you couldn't remember what silence sounded like. Defenders couldn't sleep for more than an hour at a time before another impact jolted them awake. They couldn't think straight, the constant noise disrupted thinking, made planning difficult. Men shouted to communicate, standing 3 feet apart. The ringing in your ears became permanent, a high-pitched whine that never went away, even in the brief pauses when guns were being reloaded. And the walls started to die. The lower town went first. The wooden palisades Shalagi had reinforced were designed to stop arrows and men, not industrial artillery. The first day's bombardment reduced entire sections to kindling. By day 3, gaps opened wide enough to march a company through. By day 5, the lower town's defenses existed only in scattered fragments. But Hunyadi had expected this. The lower town was a buffer, useful but expendable. The real fortress was the stone castle on the bluff. That's where Mehmed concentrated his fire. Stone walls that had stood for 200 years began to crack under the relentless pounding. Ottoman engineers understood the physics. Don't spread fire across the entire wall, focus on specific points. Hit the same section of wall over and over, methodically crushing the masonry until the binding mortar turns to dust and the stones tumble. They marked their target points with colored flags visible from the gun positions. Gunners adjusted aim after each shot, walking their fire onto the target. When they found the range, they locked it in and hammered that spot for hours. Towers crumbled. Merlins, the protective stone teeth on top of the walls, shattered under direct hits, exposing defenders. Dust hung in the air so thick you tasted stone powder in every breath, choked on it, coughed up grey phlegm. The noise inside the castle was apocalyptic. Not just the cannon fire from outside, but the sound of your own fortress dying, the groan of stressed stone, the crack of failing masonry, the crash of collapsing sections echoing through the streets. Desperate repairs. The defenders did what they could. During the few hours after dark, when Ottoman gunners slowed their fire, not stopping, but reducing to conserve powder and preserve night vision, work crews scrambled to repair damage. They packed rubble into gaps in the walls, using broken stones and timber to create crude patches. They shored up weakened sections with wooden beams scavenged from damaged buildings. Behind the worst breaches, they built secondary walls, hasty constructions of rubble and earth that wouldn't stop sustained bombardment but might slow an assault. It was exhausting, desperate labor done under constant threat. Ottoman sharpshooters watched the walls at night, and anyone who showed themselves too long risked an arrow. Small Ottoman raiding parties probed the defenses after dark, testing for weak points, killing sentries, keeping defenders on edge. Hunyadi rotated his men constantly to prevent total collapse from exhaustion. A soldier would do 6 hours on the walls, 6 hours on work crews, 6 hours rest, except rest was nearly impossible with the bombardment. He had maybe a dozen cannons of his own, small guns, 4- and 6-pounders, poorly supplied with gunpowder because Hungary's finances were a disaster. He ordered his gunners to fire sparingly, only when they had clean shots at Ottoman artillery crews. Every Ottoman gunner they killed bought maybe an hour of reduced fire while a replacement crew was brought up. Every hour mattered. Every hour let them repair a little more, rest a little more, survive a little longer. Faith as a weapon. Capistrano turned the siege into spiritual warfare. Every morning and evening he held services in the castle's chapel, a small stone building near the keep that had survived the bombardment so far. But he didn't stay safely inside. He led prayers on the walls while cannonballs screamed overhead, holding his crucifix high, voice hoarse from shouting over the thunder. To the professional soldiers, it looked like suicide, standing exposed on damaged battlements, making yourself a target, accomplishing nothing tactical. But to the peasant crusaders, it was proof their friar was protected by God. If cannonballs couldn't touch him, maybe they couldn't touch anyone fighting for Christ. The logic was insane, but it worked. Faith became a weapon Hunyadi hadn't counted on. Men who should have broken under the bombardment, who had every rational reason to desert, to flee, to hide in the deepest cellars and pray the Ottomans would show mercy, kept showing up for wall duty, kept hauling stones, kept standing watch. Morale inexplicably held. The walls are dying. By July 14th, day 11, the walls were dying faster than defenders could repair them. The lower town's defenses were completely gone, the area now occupied by Ottoman forward positions. Turkish archers and arquebusiers fired from the ruins at anyone who showed themselves on the castle walls. The earthwork bastions that had protected the lower town were flattened, reduced to scorched earth. The moat encircling the castle was half filled with rubble from collapsed wall sections, creating rough paths across. The castle's outer wall had breaches ranging from 10 to 30 feet wide, where Ottoman guns had hammered the same spots for over a week. The largest breach was where a defensive tower had stood, now just a gap filled with tumbled stones, sloping down into the moat. Defenders could see Ottoman infantry massing in the forward trenches. Siege ladders being assembled. Janissaries forming up in their white caps, checking weapons, preparing. That morning, Hunyadi walked the walls, inspecting damage. He looked like death, gaunt, fever-bright eyes, skin gray. The illness was visibly consuming him. He had to stop every few minutes to catch his breath. But he moved with purpose, checking every defensive position personally. At the main breach, the 30-foot gap where the tower had been, he stopped and stared. Rubble had tumbled into the moat, creating an easy slope the Ottomans could charge up. This would be the killing ground. He called for his best troops, Hungarian heavy infantry in half-plate armor, Serbian mercenaries with axes who'd been fighting Turks for years. Position them here. When the assault comes, this is where it hits hardest. Then he did something that surprised everyone watching. He asked Capistrano to position crusaders on the intact walls above and behind the breach, ready to support with missile fire and reinforcement if needed. Capistrano's eyes lit up. His people would fight after all. The first assault. That afternoon, the Ottoman drums changed rhythm. Not the steady background boom of artillery, a different beat, faster, sharper. The cadence of attack. From the castle walls, defenders watched the Ottoman lines shift. Infantry rising from trenches. Ladders being lifted. Shields being locked into formations. The preliminary movements before an assault. Then the advance began. The first wave hit the lower town's ruins, Akinci raiders who dismounted to fight as shock troops, sprinting across open ground toward the shattered defenses. Behind them came provincial infantry in waves, carrying scaling ladders, grappling hooks, bundles of sticks to fill in remaining moat sections. The defenders Hunyadi had positioned in the lower town ruins, militia and some of Capistrano's crusaders hidden in the rubble, opened fire. Crossbows snapped. Primitive arquebuses cracked with puffs of smoke. Men dropped in the advancing Ottoman ranks. But there were too many attackers, and the defenses were too broken. Within an hour, Ottomans swarmed over what remained of the palisades and poured into the lower town. Street fighting erupted. Vicious, intimate killing in narrow lanes choked with rubble and ash. No room for formation fighting, just individual combat and small group melees. Hungarian soldiers with axes faced Ottoman infantry with scimitars and shields. Serbian defenders with war hammers fought like demons, knowing they were battling the empire that had enslaved their homeland. Capistrano's crusaders, untrained but zealous, threw themselves into combat with crosses stitched to their chests, swinging scythes and clubs, screaming prayers. The combat was brutal. Blood turned the dust and ash to black mud. Bodies fell across each other in doorways and alleyways. By mid-afternoon, the lower town was lost. But Hunyadi had planned for exactly this. The death trap. As Ottomans took control of the lower town, they realized they'd captured a death trap. The castle sat on the bluff directly above, and Hunyadi had positioned his best archers and gunners on those walls. They opened fire straight down into the packed streets below. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained into Ottoman ranks from above. Arquebuses cracked. Small cannons loaded with bags of scrap metal, nails, broken chains, pottery shards, turned narrow approaches into killing zones. The Ottomans had nowhere to take cover. Every doorway, every wall fragment could hide a defender with a crossbow. They tried to push toward the castle gates. The approaches were deliberately narrow, ancient defensive design that forced attackers into choke points flanked by towers. Defenders in those towers poured fire from multiple angles. Attackers were cut down in heaps. Bodies piled 4 and 5 deep in the approaches. The Janissaries, held in reserve until now, were committed to force the gates. These were the elite veterans of Constantinople and a dozen other sieges. They moved with professional discipline, shields locked, advancing through the fire methodically. They got within 50 feet of the gates before concentrated arquebus fire from the flanking towers stopped them. Even the best infantry in the world can't advance when half the front rank drops in 10 seconds. They fell back, regrouped, tried again. Failed again. By nightfall, the Ottomans held the lower town, but the castle was intact. The cost had been horrific. Estimates ranged from 500 to over 1,000 Ottoman dead in a single afternoon's fighting. Defender casualties were lighter but still significant, maybe 200 killed and wounded, losses they could barely afford. Underground war. Mehmed watched from his pavilion, face unreadable behind his beard. His generals expected him to pause, consolidate gains, give troops time to recover. Instead, he gave new orders. Bring up the sappers. That night, while exhausted defenders tried to grab a few hours of sleep, Ottoman engineers began digging. Not toward the walls, under them. They started approach trenches, zigzagging lines carved into the earth that allowed soldiers to advance while protected from defensive fire. At the end of these trenches, deep shafts went down into the ground. Mining operations. The goal. Tunnel under the castle's foundations, pack chambers with gunpowder, and blow the walls from below. Create breaches too large and too sudden to defend. It was the tactic that had worked at Constantinople. Mehmed was applying the lessons of his greatest victory. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? One that's underneath you, in the dark, coming closer every hour? By July 16, day 13, the defenders could hear them. The scrape of shovels moving earth. The creak of timber supports being installed. The sounds came from below, transmitted through the stone foundations. You'd be standing on the castle walls and feel a faint vibration through your feet. The Ottomans were underneath them. Hunyadi ordered countermines dug immediately. Defenders started their own tunnels, burrowing down from inside the castle, listening for the enemy. The underground war was nightmare fuel. When a countermine broke through into an Ottoman tunnel, fighting erupted in spaces barely wide enough for one man to crawl. Total darkness. Torches used up the limited air too fast. You fought by touch and sound, stabbing with daggers because there was no room to swing, strangling with bare hands, smashing skulls against tunnel walls. Sometimes the tunnels collapsed during the fighting, burying both sides alive. Neither side could retreat, the tunnels were too narrow to turn around. You fought forward until one side was dead. The defenders collapsed over 50 Ottoman mining attempts this way, filling enemy tunnels with rubble, drowning some with diverted water from the river. But the Ottomans kept digging. They had hundreds of miners, Christian slaves from the Balkans, expendable labor. Some tunnels got through. The mine explodes. July 18th, day 15. Dawn. The explosion came. Without warning. A section of the castle's outer wall, about 40 feet of masonry, lifted into the air in a gout of fire and pulverized stone. The blast echo rolled across the fortress like thunder. Debris rained down hundreds of feet away. The shockwave shattered windows in buildings 200 yards from the blast. When the dust cleared, there was a breach. Wide open. Rubble sloping down into the moat on one side, up into the castle on the other. Through that breach came the Janissaries. White caps visible through the dust, moving fast. Composite bows firing as they advanced. Arquebuses cracking. Swords drawn for close combat. They hit the breach before most defenders even realized what had happened. For one terrible moment, it looked like the castle would fall. Then John Hunyadi appeared. 70 years old, dying, armored despite the fever that should have left him bedridden, sword in hand, leading his household guard in a counterattack. The fighting at the breach was hell. Elite against elite. Hunyadi's guards, Hungarian knights who'd fought beside him for decades, crashed into the Janissaries. No fancy tactics. Just brutal close-quarters combat. Steel on steel. Shields smashing into faces. Daggers finding gaps in armor. Bodies piled in the rubble. Blood made the broken stones slick. Men lost footing and were killed before they could rise. The Janissaries were driven back slowly, yard by yard, fighting for every foot of ground. By midday, the breach was retaken. Ottoman banners torn down. The Janissaries retreated to the lower town, leaving hundreds of their dead. But everyone knew the truth. The defenders were bleeding out. Every attack cost lives they couldn't replace. The Ottomans had endless reinforcements just over the horizon. One more breach, one more assault, and there wouldn't be enough defenders left to hold the line. Hunyadi knew it. Shilagi knew it. Every professional soldier knew it. And across the battlefield, Mehmed knew it too. Just keep the pressure on. Grind them down. Wait for the inevitable. But Hunyadi had one desperate gamble left. One move so audacious, so insane, that no Ottoman commander would see it coming. He was going to attack. Not defend, attack. On the water. The river attack. Attack. How? The castle was surrounded. Ottomans outnumbered them 3-1. Hunyadi's forces were exhausted, depleted, barely holding the walls. The answer was the one place Mehmed thought he'd already won, the river. The Danube wasn't decoration, it was a weapon. Mehmed had brought 200 river galleys and transport ships north. A massive fleet assembled over months. The strategy was textbook: blockade the fortress from the water, cut resupply routes, starve them into surrender. Ottoman ships anchored in a defensive line just below where the Sava met the Danube. Close enough to bombard the fortress from the river and stop any boats trying to reach Belgrade. Shore batteries supported the fleet, small cannons positioned on the banks to catch any vessel trying to run the blockade in crossfire. It was solid strategy, and it had worked in previous sieges. But Mehmed made one miscalculation: he assumed the defenders would stay defensive. Hunyadi had been planning the river attack since before the siege began. He had quietly assembled a fleet while Mehmed was still marching north, commandeering riverboats from fishermen along the Danube, offering payment or simply taking them in the name of Hungary's defense. Merchant vessels were hastily armed with whatever light guns he could spare. Where he couldn't find boats, he had carpenters lash together rafts reinforced with timber. Maybe 50 vessels total. Mismatched, undergunned, vastly outnumbered by the Ottoman fleet. But they had advantages Ottoman galleys didn't. They were crewed by men who'd spent their lives on the Danube and knew every current, every sandbar, every trick the river could play. They were smaller, more maneuverable in the twisting currents where the two rivers met. And Hunyadi was willing to do what Ottoman commanders wouldn't expect: go on the offensive when he should be cowering behind walls. Chaos on the water. July 14th, the same day Ottomans assaulted the lower town. While fighting raged in the streets below the castle, Hunyadi took his fleet downriver. He left command of the fortress to Shalagi and boarded the lead boat, a reinforced fishing vessel with a light cannon mounted at the bow. Despite the fever racking his body, despite advisors begging him to stay in the fortress, he insisted on commanding personally. His presence mattered. The rivermen needed to see him, needed to believe this suicide mission could work. They rowed downstream, using the current to build speed. The Danube was running fast in midsummer, swollen with snowmelt from the Alps. That current was an ally if you knew how to use it. The Ottoman fleet saw them coming but didn't react immediately. Why would they? 50 boats against 200. It looked like desperation, not tactics. Then Hunyadi's lead boats opened fire. The first cannon shots were signal and shock. Light guns cracked from the Christian boats, 4 and 6 pounders that couldn't sink galleys but could kill crews on open decks. Arrows and crossbow bolts arced across the water in clouds. Ottoman sailors scrambled for weapons, shouting contradictory orders, not sure if this was a real attack or a diversion. The Christian boats closed fast, using currents and oars together to build momentum. Then Hunyadi deployed what he'd been saving: fire ships. 3 boats packed with everything that burns. Pitch barrels cracked open and spread across the decks. Straw bales soaked in oil. Timber from demolished buildings. Animal fat from the fortress stores. The boats were floating bonfires waiting to be lit. Skeleton crews, volunteers who understood this was likely suicide, sailed them into position. When they were 100 yards from the Ottoman fleet's anchored line, they set the fires. The flames caught instantly. Oil-soaked straw erupted. Pitch burned with thick black smoke. Within seconds, the fire ships were infernos. The crews jumped overboard and swam for pickup boats following behind. Not all of them made it. Ottoman archers on the galleys shot at men struggling in the water. Some drowned, dragged under by their clothes. But most were pulled aboard Christian boats and given oars. No time to rest, the battle was just starting. The burning ships drifted straight into the Ottoman fleet. Panic erupted on the water. Ottoman galleys were anchored close together for mutual support and coordinated defense, standard fleet tactics. But that meant no room to maneuver. When captains saw fire ships bearing down on them, they screamed for crews to cut anchor lines, to row backward, to do anything to avoid collision. Ships collided with each other, trying to evade. Oars tangled between vessels. Crews shouted at neighboring ships that were backing into them. The formation disintegrated into chaos. When the first fire ship hit an Ottoman galley, flames spread like plague. Pitch stuck to wood and didn't wash off. Rigging, Hemp rope soaked in tar to preserve it, ignited in seconds. Sails caught. Within minutes, Ottoman ships were burning, crews abandoning them by jumping overboard. But the Danube in midsummer wasn't the Mediterranean. The water was cold, the current strong. Men in armor drowned. Men without armor got swept downstream, and hypothermia took them. The river didn't care which side you fought for. Through the smoke and confusion, Hunyadi's boats closed in. The fighting on the water was brutal chaos. Christian crews pulled alongside Ottoman galleys and boarded. No formations, no tactics, just scrambling over the rails with weapons drawn, hand-to-hand combat on slippery, rocking decks while ships burned around them. Hunyadi's rivermen fought with the fury of men who'd lost everything to Ottoman raids. Serbian refugees who'd watched their villages burn now set Turkish ships ablaze and felt something like justice. Hungarian soldiers who knew this was their last chance to hurt the enemy before the fortress fell made every swing count. They used axes and boarding pikes, weapons designed for fighting on boats where swinging a sword was difficult. They grappled and stabbed and pushed men overboard. They set fires on captured ships rather than trying to sail them away, turning every victory into another weapon against the fleet. Ottoman Marines fought back hard. These weren't sailors, they were infantry positioned on the ships for exactly this kind of combat. Professional soldiers with scimitars and shields, veterans who'd fought naval battles in the Aegean and Black Seas. But they weren't fighting in open water. They were fighting in a river current, at a confluence where the water did unpredictable things. Ships spun in eddies. Boats drifted into each other unexpectedly. The Ottoman advantage in training and equipment meant less when you were fighting to keep your balance on a deck tilting under your feet. The battle raged for hours. By mid-afternoon, the Ottoman fleet was shattered. At least a dozen galleys captured, though most were too damaged to be useful and were scuttled. More burning or already sunk, only masts visible above the waterline. The survivors cut their anchor lines and fled downstream, oars thrashing the water in panicked retreat. Hunyadi stood on the deck of a captured galley, sword still in hand, watching them run. He'd broken Mem's river blockade. Belgrade could be resupplied. The stranglehold was lifted. It was an impossible victory. And it nearly killed him. The price of victory. Hunyadi collapsed on the return voyage. The adrenaline that had kept him upright through the battle drained away, and the fever came roaring back. He went down on the deck like a puppet with cut strings. His officers thought he'd died, no pulse they could find, skin gray and cold despite the summer heat. They carried him off the boat when they docked in Belgrade. Capistrano was summoned. Last rites were administered. Shalagi prepared to take full command, expecting Hunyadi to die within hours. For 2 days, Hunyadi burned, unconscious, delirious when he surfaced. He raved in multiple languages, Hungarian, Latin, Serbian, even Turkish picked up from decades fighting them. He called for men who died at Varna 12 years earlier. He gave orders for battles long finished. On the 3rd day, he opened his eyes and asked for a situation report. The old bastard wasn't done yet. But everyone who saw him knew the truth. He'd bought them time by spending his life. The cost of the river victory was killing him. Mem's rage. Across the battlefield, in his silk pavilion, Mehmed was not handling defeat well. His fleet, the weapon meant to starve Belgrade into submission, destroyed by fishing boats. His blockade broken by rivermen and peasants. His reputation as the conqueror of Constantinople, damaged by an old man who should have been in bed dying. Ottoman sources later claimed the Sultan calmly reassessed strategy and made tactical adjustments. Christian sources paint a different picture. Mehmed in a rage, threatening to execute the fleet admiral before being talked down by advisors. The admiral was stripped of rank and sent back to Constantinople in disgrace. What's certain is Mehmed's decision: no more gradual pressure, no more waiting for starvation. He wanted Belgrade taken by force immediately, regardless of cost. He ordered an all-out assault on the castle. Every available soldier, every remaining gun, everything. The message to his commanders was clear: take the fortress or die trying. The defenders had maybe 72 hours to prepare for what was coming. preparing for the end. Hunyadi, still weak from fever, directed repairs from a chair because standing for long periods left him dizzy. The breach from the mine explosion was shored up with timber frames filled with rubble. New barricades went up behind weak points, rubble walls that wouldn't stop sustained assault but might slow it enough for defenders to react. Every resource was redistributed. Gunpowder was pulled and rationed to the guns with the best fields of fire. Arrows were counted, they were running low. Every shaft had to count. Arquebus were cleaned, checked, loaded. Axes and warhammers were sharpened. Water barrels were positioned at every defensive position because fire was a constant threat, and men fighting in July heat needed to drink or they'd collapse. Capistrano held services around the clock. His crusaders prayed in shifts. When they weren't working, they were on their knees. The castle never stopped echoing with hymns. To outsiders, it might have sounded like madness. To the defenders, it was armor. Shalagi walked the walls after dark, checking sentries, making sure no one fell asleep on watch. Men were so exhausted they could fall asleep standing up. He carried a bucket of cold water and splashed anyone whose eyes started to close. Everyone knew what was coming. Mehmed had committed his prestige now. He couldn't withdraw without looking weak, and weakness for a sultan meant rebellion, assassination, the end of everything. Which meant the next assault would be total. Everything Mehmed had thrown at the walls in one overwhelming wave. If the Ottomans broke through, there weren't enough defenders left to stop them. No reserves, no fallback positions. Just the final line. The final assault. July 21st arrived. Day 18. At dawn, the Ottoman bombardment intensified beyond anything the defenders had experienced. Every gun Mehmed possessed opened fire at the same time. Not the usual rotation, everything at once. The noise was apocalyptic. Not individual shots but a continuous roar like sustained thunder, like the earth itself was screaming. The walls disappeared into clouds of dust and pulverized stone. Visibility dropped to nothing. Defenders couldn't see 10 feet. The air became unbreathable. Stone dust so thick men tied cloth over their faces and still choked, coughed up gray phlegm, felt their lungs burning. This went on for 6 hours without pause. Then suddenly the guns stopped. The silence was shocking. After 18 days of constant bombardment, the absence of noise felt wrong, physically disorienting. Ears still rang. Men looked at each other in confusion. Through the clearing dust, they saw them coming. The Janissaries. All of them. Not held in reserve this time, advancing in a single massive formation. Thousands of white-capped elite infantry in organized ranks. Provincial troops on the flanks. Every soldier Mehmed could commit, moving in near silence. Just the thud of feet, the clink of weapons. Disciplined. Professional. Unstoppable. This was the moment. The final throw. Win or lose in the next few hours. Hunyadi stood on the walls despite the fever, sword drawn. Shalagi beside him. Professional soldiers at their posts. And below in the courtyard, Giovanni da Capistrano knelt with his crucifix, surrounded by 25,000 crusaders who believed God would save them. The breach. The Janissaries hit the breaches. The first. Janissaries reached the breaches within minutes. They didn't charge screaming, they advanced in formation. Shields locked in the front rank. Arquebusiers in the second rank firing coordinated volleys. Swordsmen following behind to exploit any gap. Professional. Methodical. Terrifying in their discipline. Hunyadi's troops at the breaches fired back. Arquebus cracked. Crossbows snapped. Men dropped on both sides. But for every Janissary that fell, 2 more stepped over the body and kept coming. They swarmed up the rubble-filled breaches, using the broken stones as steps. Where walls still stood, they threw up scaling ladders, 3 men holding the base, 2 climbing with shields on their backs to deflect arrows. Where there were no ladders, they climbed bare-handed, finding holds in cracked masonry. The first wave hit the defenders, and the real killing started. Steel on steel. Poleaxes against scimitars. War hammers against shields. The fighting was so compressed you couldn't swing properly. Just stab, shove, use your weight to push opponents off balance on the unstable rubble. The defenders held. Barely. Hunyadi's household guard anchored the main breach. Hungarian knights in half-plate armor, fighting shoulder to shoulder, refusing to give ground. These were men who'd fought beside Hunyadi for 20 years, who'd survived Varna and a dozen other battles. They knew their business. Serbian mercenaries held the flanks, killing with the cold fury of men defending the last free piece of their conquered homeland. They gave no quarter because they expected none. But the pressure was relentless. More Janissaries kept coming. Fresh troops cycling in to replace the wounded and dead. The defenders had no reserves. Every man was already committed. When someone fell, there was no replacement, just a gap in the line that others had to stretch to cover. Gaps started opening. An Ottoman banner went up on the battlements. The standard-bearer, a Janissary officer, planted it on a section of wall the Ottomans had just taken. The crescent moon and star snapping in the wind above stones Christian defenders had held for 18 days. Then another banner rose 50 yards away. Then a third. The Janissaries had breached the walls in multiple places. They were inside the castle, establishing footholds, more troops pouring through behind them. Hunyadi saw it happening from his command position and knew what it meant. Minutes, maybe less, before the defensive line collapsed entirely. Once the Janissaries had secured positions inside the walls, they'd widen the breaches, bring in more troops, overwhelm the defenders through sheer mass. Constantinople had fallen exactly this way. Breaches. Footholds. Collapse. He rallied his remaining household guard for a counterattack at the main breach. If they could push the Ottomans back there, seal that penetration, maybe they could hold long enough to. Then he heard something that made him turn. The charge. From the castle courtyard, a sound rose that didn't seem human. 25,000 voices screaming at once. Not a battle cry, not a war shout, something primal, religious, beyond reason. Giovanni da Capistrano had seized his crucifix banner and was running. This 70-year-old skeletal friar was sprinting toward the breaches, screaming in Latin for his crusaders to follow. And they followed. Not in formation, not with any tactical plan. A mob. A human flood. Peasants with scythes still stained from last year's harvest. Old men with rusted swords their fathers had carried. Criminals with clubs. Serbian refugees with axes. All of them running, screaming prayers, absolutely convinced God was charging with them. Hunyadi later wrote that he tried to stop them. It was suicide. Untrained rabble throwing themselves at the best infantry in the world. It would be a massacre that accomplished nothing except depleting the last reserves. But Capistrano was beyond anyone's control, and his crusaders wouldn't have stopped if the Pope himself ordered it. They believed this was the moment. The prophesied battle. Heaven or death. Nothing in between. They hit the Janissaries at the breaches like a breaking wave. The impossible. What happened next should have been a slaughter. The Janissaries were elite soldiers, taken as boys from Christian families, converted, trained since childhood in barracks where every day was combat drill. Veterans of Constantinople, of campaigns across 3 continents. Disciplined, armored, professional killers. The Crusaders were none of those things. Most had never been in a fight more serious than a tavern brawl. They wore whatever they'd been working in when they joined Capistrano. They carried tools, not weapons. By every measure of military science, they should have been annihilated in minutes. But there were so many of them. They swarmed the breaches like ants, like floodwater, like something elemental that couldn't be stopped by tactics or steel. When the first ranks were cut down, and they were slaughtered by Janissary swords, more kept coming. And more behind them. And more. The Janissaries found themselves overwhelmed, not by skill, but by mass. A Janissary would kill 2 crusaders, 3, 4, then be tackled by 5 more who grabbed his arms, his legs, pulled him down through sheer weight. Crusaders wrestled weapons from Janissary hands, beat armored soldiers with rocks when their improvised weapons broke. When one crusader died, 3 more filled the space, stepping over the body, pressing forward. It wasn't warfare. It was drowning in bodies. Janissaries, elite troops who'd broken the walls of Constantinople, found themselves pulled off the battlements by peasants who didn't know the first thing about combat but believed with absolute certainty they were invincible. The Ottoman soldiers began giving ground. Not routing yet, not fleeing, but backing up, trying to create space to use their superior training, being pushed back by the sheer press of bodies. Hunyadi saw it happening, couldn't believe it, but recognized the moment. He rallied every professional soldier he had left. Hungarian cavalry who'd dismounted to fight on the walls. Serbian mercenaries who'd been held in reserve. His personal guard who'd been preparing to counterattack. He led them in a coordinated assault on the Janissaries' flanks while Capistrano's mob pushed from the front. Now the Ottomans were caught in a vice. Trained soldiers hitting them from the sides with disciplined attacks. A religious mob grinding them down from the front through sheer mass. Their formation, their greatest advantage, fragmenting under pressure from multiple directions. Sections of the Janissary line began to retreat. Then whole units. Officers tried to maintain cohesion, but the pressure was too much. The retreat became a rout. The Janissaries broke. Actually broke. These troops who'd never fled a battlefield in living memory turned and ran back through the breaches, back across the rubble, back toward the safety of the Ottoman lines. Provincial troops on the flanks saw the elite retreating and panicked. If the Janissaries couldn't hold, what chance did they have? The rout spread like fire through dry grass. And Capistrano's crusaders, mad with victory and religious ecstasy, didn't stop at the walls. The pursuit. They poured out of the fortress after them. Hunyadi screamed orders to hold position. No one listened. 10,000 crusaders, maybe more, impossible to count in the chaos, flooded out of the gates and breaches, chasing the broken Ottoman army. Across open ground. No formation, no command structure. Just a mob pursuing a routed enemy. It should have been suicide. Ottoman cavalry should have regrouped and slaughtered them in the open. Any competent commander would have used the Crusaders' lack of discipline against them. But the Ottoman command structure had broken down. In the chaos and smoke, with the elite Janissaries in full retreat, provincial commanders didn't know what was happening. Some thought the entire fortress garrison had sallied out. Others thought Christian reinforcements had arrived. Confusion spread faster than accurate information. The Crusaders reached the Ottoman camp before organized resistance could form. They fell on the artillery positions like locusts. Gunners, non-combatants trained to operate cannons, not fight infantry, were killed before they could grab weapons. Crusaders smashed firing mechanisms with hammers, stuffed rubble down barrels, poured water into powder magazines. Decades of military engineering destroyed in minutes by men who couldn't read but understood that breaking things required no education. They raided supply tents, set fires, looted, created total chaos. Ottoman troops tried to rally. Sipahi cavalry regrouped in sections, attempting to organize a counterattack. But the camp was a maze of tents and supply wagons. Cavalry needed open ground to be effective. Here they were hemmed in, forced to fight dismounted, losing their advantage. And in his silk pavilion on the hill, Sultan Mehmed II was in danger. The Sultan's flight. Crusaders actually reached the command pavilion. They didn't know whose tent it was, most couldn't read the Ottoman standards, but they could see it was important. Silk instead of canvas. Guards in better armor. Officers running in and out with messages. So they attacked it. Mehmed's bodyguards, elite soldiers whose only job was protecting the Sultan, barely got him out in time. They rushed Mehmed out the back of the pavilion as Crusaders burst through the front, lifted him onto a horse, formed a protective ring around him as they retreated up the hill. In the confusion, Mehmed was hit. Sources differ on exactly what happened. Christian chronicles say an arrow or crossbow bolt struck him in the thigh. Ottoman records mention the Sultan being lightly wounded but downplay the severity. What's certain, Mehmed walked with a limp for the rest of his life. The wound never fully healed. Whether it was serious or not, the psychological impact was devastating. The Sultan, the conqueror of Constantinople, master of an empire stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates, had been driven from his own command post by a mob of peasants. The fighting raged through the Ottoman camp for hours. It wasn't organized battle, it was riot and counter-riot. Crusaders burning tents, killing anyone they caught. Ottoman troops slowly reasserting discipline, forming up in defensive positions, fighting back. By late afternoon, Sipahi cavalry had finally organized coherent counterattacks. They charged Crusader groups in the more open areas of the camp, cutting down hundreds. The mob had no answer to heavy cavalry, no formations to maintain, no way to defend against armored horsemen. The Crusaders broke and ran back toward Belgrade, carrying whatever loot they could grab, captured weapons, armor, banners as trophies, supplies. By nightfall, they retreated inside the fortress. Exhausted, bloodied, many wounded, but triumphant. The siege was over. The retreat. That night, Mehmed held council with his commanders in a hastily erected replacement tent. The losses were catastrophic. Ottoman sources later minimized them, claiming a few thousand casualties, tactical withdrawals, minor setbacks. Christian chronicles claimed 10,000 to 30,000 Ottoman dead and wounded. The truth was probably between those extremes, but everyone agreed the losses were devastating. The fleet was destroyed. The artillery train was wrecked, guns spiked or captured, irreplaceable bronze cannons at the bottom of the Danube. The camp was half burned. Supply dumps looted. Morale shattered. And the fortress they'd bombarded for 18 days, mined, assaulted with everything they had, still stood. Mehmed's commanders advised withdrawal. Some sources say the Sultan resisted, wanted to continue the siege, refused to accept defeat. Others claim he made the decision immediately, recognizing that continuing would only compound the disaster. What we know, that night, the order went out. Prepare to withdraw. July 22, Day 19. The Ottoman army began its retreat south. From the walls of Belgrade, defenders watched them go. The Ottoman camp was struck methodically. Tents came down in organized sections. Supply wagons loaded. Artillery, what remained, hitched to ox teams and hauled south. Infantry formed marching columns. Cavalry took rear guard positions, watching for any pursuit. It took all day. By evening, the plains south of Belgrade were empty except for corpses and the debris of failed conquest. The bells of Belgrade began to ring. Not alarm bells, victory bells. The sound carried for miles across the summer countryside. Inside the castle, men who'd been certain they would die wept openly. Professional soldiers who'd fought a dozen battles sat down and couldn't stand back up, legs shaking from exhaustion and relief. Capistrano's crusaders sang hymns until their voices gave out, then kept singing in whispers. Hunyadi stood on the walls watching the Ottoman retreat, leaning on Shalagi because fever had left him too weak to stand alone. Shalagi said something, probably congratulations, probably relief that they'd survived the impossible. Hunyadi didn't respond immediately. He just watched the Ottoman banners disappear over the southern horizon. He knew what they had accomplished. Belgrade had held. Europe was safe, for now. Mehmed, invincible Mehmed, had been stopped. But he also knew the cost. The castle was ruins. Thousands dead in the streets and moat. His own body failing, the fever burning him up from inside. They had won. But victories like this destroy you even as they save you. The question now, would he live long enough to see what his victory meant? The answer was already written in the fever consuming him. The death of Hunyadi. The victory lasted exactly 3 weeks. Then János Hunyadi died. The fever that had plagued him throughout the siege worsened in the days after the Ottomans retreated. Medical knowledge in 1456 was primitive. Physicians talked about balancing humors, applied leeches, prescribed prayers. They had no concept of typhus or plague, both of which ran rampant through Belgrade during the siege, spreading through the packed fortress and the bodies decomposing in the summer heat. Whatever disease consumed Hunyadi, It was killing him faster now that the adrenaline of battle was gone. On August 11, 1456, in the town of Zemun, just across the Danube from Belgrade, John Hunyadi stopped breathing. He was 70 years old, possibly older. He'd spent his last strength saving Hungary. There's no record of final words, no deathbed speech. He simply burned up from the inside in a fever dream, probably unaware of where he was or that he'd won. His body was taken to Transylvania for burial in a Catholic cathedral. But even in death, Hunyadi couldn't escape the chaos he'd fought against. Within a generation, that cathedral changed hands between Catholics and Protestants multiple times. His tomb was moved, damaged in conflicts, restored, lost, rediscovered. The man who saved Christian Europe from Ottoman conquest couldn't find peace even in his grave. But Belgrade stood because of him. That mattered more than where his bones rested. The death of Capistrano. Giovanni da Capistrano outlived him by 2 months. After the siege, the friar continued his work, preaching in towns along the Danube, telling the story of Belgrade as proof that God intervened in human affairs, that faith could defeat empires. He was 70 years old, skeletal from a lifetime of fasting, and had been exposed to plague during the siege. On October 23, 1456, he collapsed mid-sermon in the town of Alok. Dead within hours. The Catholic Church canonized him in 1690, 234 years later, transforming his fanaticism into holy zeal. Today he's Saint John of Capistrano, patron saint of military chaplains and jurists. Churches bear his name. His feast day is celebrated on October 23. But the peasants who followed him to Belgrade and survived? History doesn't record their names. They went back to their villages, back to plowing fields they didn't own, back to giving most of their harvest to lords who hadn't risked anything at Belgrade. Most probably died within a few years. Plague, starvation, the next round of Ottoman raids that would inevitably come. Anonymous. Forgotten. They'd saved Europe and received nothing but the promise of heaven. Whether heaven delivered on that promise, we'll never know. The fate of Szilágy. Mihai Szilágy survived the siege and continued fighting. He defended Hungary's crumbling southern frontier for 4 more years, leading raids into Ottoman territory, trying to hold together a kingdom that was tearing itself apart politically. He helped raise Hunyadi's son, Matthias, to the Hungarian throne, becoming one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. But in 1460, during a campaign in Ottoman-held Serbia, he was captured. Mehmed II, who never forgot Belgrade, had Szilágy brought to him personally. Multiple sources record that the Sultan offered him wealth, titles, and position if he converted to Islam. Some chronicles say Mehmed respected Szilágy as one of the defenders who'd humiliated him and wanted to turn that defeat into propaganda by converting a Christian hero. Szilágy refused. He was executed. Sources differ on the method. Some say beheading. Others claim he was sawn in half, a particularly brutal Ottoman execution reserved for important enemies. Ottoman records don't specify, which suggests it was horrific enough they didn't want it publicized. The last of Belgrade's 3 defenders was gone. Mehmed's legacy. And Mehmed. He lived another 25 years and died at 49, possibly poisoned by his own son, possibly from natural illness. Ottoman palace intrigue makes certainty impossible. The wound from Belgrade never fully healed. Whether it was the arrow to the thigh or something psychological, Mehmed walked with a visible limp for the rest of his life. Court observers noted it. Foreign ambassadors mentioned it in reports. The man who'd conquered Constantinople carried a permanent reminder of the fortress that defeated him. He campaigned relentlessly after Belgrade, conquered Serbia completely by 1459, took Bosnia, fought wars in Anatolia and the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent under his rule. He even briefly captured Otranto in southern Italy, putting Ottoman troops on Western European soil for the first time. But he never attacked Belgrade again. Not once in 25 years. He had the army. He had the resources. He had every strategic reason to take the fortress that controlled the Danube. But he never tried. Some historians argue it was pragmatic. Belgrade had proven too costly, better to expand elsewhere. Others believe the defeat haunted him, that he couldn't stomach another failure where he'd already lost so catastrophically. The historical record can't tell us what Mehmed felt, but his actions speak. He avoided Belgrade for the rest of his life. The Ottoman Empire continued expanding for another century after Mehmed's death, but the failure at Belgrade bought Europe 70 years. Not until the 1520s did the Turks seriously threaten Hungary again. And by then, the world had changed. Gunpowder technology had evolved. Fortress design had adapted. The angled bastions and tres Italienne fortifications that would define the next century of warfare were developed partly in response to lessons learned at Belgrade and Constantinople. European armies had modernized. The psychological shock of Constantinople's fall had faded. Belgrade's 19 days altered the trajectory of empires. Why they won. So why did they win? Not superior numbers, they were outnumbered at least 2-1, possibly worse. Not better fortifications, the walls were medieval design, half demolished by modern artillery. Not outside help, Europe abandoned them completely. They won because of factors that don't fit neatly into military equations. Hunyadi's tactical brilliance and absolute refusal to surrender, even while dying. His river attack, audacious to the point of insanity, broke the Ottoman blockade when conventional wisdom said to stay defensive. Capistrano's ability to make peasants believe they were invincible. His crusaders shouldn't have affected the outcome, untrained rabble with farm tools. But they charged into the final assault with such absolute conviction that they overwhelmed elite troops through sheer mass and will. The desperate courage of professional soldiers who knew they defended the last line. Serbian mercenaries fighting for their enslaved homeland. Hungarian knights who'd spent careers battling the Ottomans and refused to let them pass. And luck. Pure, inexplicable luck. During the final assault, when everything that could go right for the defenders did, and everything that could go wrong for the Ottomans did. Remove any single element, and Belgrade falls. Mehmed takes Hungary. Vienna is threatened decades earlier. The entire course of European history shifts. Instead, the fortress held. The noon bells. The noon bells still ring in Catholic churches across the world. Bells ring at noon every day. Most people have no idea why. It's just tradition, something churches do. But that tradition started on July 22, 1456, when Pope Calixtus III ordered daily bells to commemorate Belgrade's victory. He wanted Christianity to remember the day God, or fate, or human courage, stopped the Ottoman advance. 600 years later, the bells still ring. In cathedrals and village churches. In countries that didn't exist in 1456. Rung by priests who've forgotten why. They ring for the defenders who held impossible walls. For the old men who refused to run. For the peasants who charged into hell, believing heaven waited on the other side. They ring for 19 days when the world balanced on a knife's edge at the confluence of two rivers and didn't fall. The lesson. Here's what I want you to take from this story. History isn't inevitable. It's not the mechanical clash of forces where the bigger army always wins. It's the product of individual choices made under unimaginable pressure by people who had every reason to quit and didn't. Belgrade should have fallen. By every measure, numbers, resources, technology, it should have been another Constantinople. But two 70-year-old men and an army of peasants said no. And that no echoed for 70 years. If this story moved you, if you see why these 19 days matter, hit that like button and subscribe to Dark History Class. Share this with someone who needs to hear about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This is the kind of history that shouldn't be forgotten. What other battles changed everything but get overlooked today? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for spending this time with me. These stories matter. These people matter. And I'll see you in the next one.